February 14th, 1943, Guadalcanal airfield, Solomon Islands. Marine Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh watched the new fighter taxi toward the coral strip, its distinctive inverted gull wings catching the equatorial sun like nothing he had ever seen before. The Chance Vought F4U Corsair looked wrong, aggressive, almost predatory in ways that violated every assumption about what carrier fighters should be. Its massive Pratt and Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine jutted forward like a battering ram, while those strange bent wings suggested an aircraft designed by someone who had decided conventional aerodynamics were merely suggestions rather than laws. The Navy had rejected it for carrier operations. Too dangerous, they said. The long nose blocked forward visibility during landing approach. The stiff landing gear made deck landings a nightmare. Pilots called it the Ensign Eliminator after 3 fatal carrier accidents during qualification trials. So the Marines got the unwanted fighters, the aircraft the Navy considered too temperamental for their precision carrier operations. What Walsh didn't know, what nobody could know yet, was that Japanese pilots were about to give this rejected aircraft a name that would echo through the Pacific War. Whistling Death, and they would learn to fear that sound more than anything else in the sky. The morning briefing had been unusually tense. Intelligence reports indicated heavy Japanese fighter concentrations around Rabaul, their massive fortress base 400 miles northwest of Guadalcanal. The Japanese had been reinforcing their air units throughout January, replacing losses from months of brutal attrition over the Solomons. Allied reconnaissance counted over 200 aircraft at Rabaul's 4 airfields, including the Imperial Japanese Navy's elite fighter units flying the legendary Mitsubishi A6M0. Walsh had accumulated 15 confirmed victories flying the Grumman F4F Wildcat, enough combat experience to understand the tactical realities of Pacific air warfare. The Wildcat was reliable, tough, and could absorb punishment that would destroy Japanese fighters. But it was also slow, underpowered, and completely outclassed in maneuverability by enemy aircraft that could turn inside any Allied fighter's radius. Every engagement became a careful balance between exploiting American advantages in firepower and structural strength, while avoiding the turning combat where Japanese pilots held overwhelming tactical superiority. The Corsair represented a quantum leap beyond anything Walsh had flown. Its Pratt and Whitney R2800 engine produced 2,000 horsepower, nearly double the Wildcat's output. Maximum speed exceeded 400 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, making it the fastest fighter in the Pacific theater by substantial margins. Most impressively, the rate of climb approached 3,000 feet per minute, performance that would allow American pilots to dictate engagement altitude for the first time since Pearl Harbor. But raw performance numbers couldn't capture the psychological impact of strapping into an aircraft that felt fundamentally different from anything in American inventory. The cockpit sat 11 feet above the ground, requiring a 6-step ladder to reach. Forward visibility was minimal during ground operations, forcing pilots to S-turn continuously during taxi to avoid obstacles they couldn't see directly ahead. The massive engine cowling blocked everything forward of the aircraft except what could be glimpsed through peripheral vision around the cowling's edges. Engine start produced a distinctive sound that would become legendary across the Pacific. The R2800's 18 cylinders firing in sequence created a deep, rumbling growl that built to a crackling roar as Walsh advanced the throttle for run-up procedures. At full power, the propeller tips exceeded 700 miles per hour, breaking the sound barrier and creating a distinctive whistling shriek that could be heard for miles. Japanese soldiers on the ground would learn to recognize that sound long before American fighters came into visual range, giving them precious seconds to seek cover before the Corsair's devastating firepower arrived. Takeoff demonstrated the Corsair's overwhelming power advantage. The fighter lifted off after less than 700 feet of ground roll, climbing at an angle that seemed impossible for such a large aircraft. Within 4 minutes, Walsh had reached 15,000 feet, an altitude that would have required nearly 10 minutes in his old Wildcat. The performance difference wasn't incremental, it was revolutionary, transforming fundamental assumptions about what single-engine fighters could accomplish. Level flight characteristics at 15,000 feet revealed both the Corsair's greatest strengths and its most challenging handling quirks. Cruise speed at 75% power indicated 320 miles per hour, effortless velocity that required constant attention to prevent overspeeding. The aircraft wanted to fly fast, accelerating eagerly at the slightest throttle input, but this eagerness created challenges during formation flying, where maintaining precise position required continuous throttle adjustments that could exhaust pilots during extended missions. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The control response felt heavy compared to the Wildcat's light touch. The Corsair required deliberate pressure on the control stick to initiate maneuvers. But once committed to a turn or roll, the aircraft responded with surprising authority. The heavy controls actually provided advantages during high-speed combat, where lighter fighters became dangerously sensitive to control inputs. Pilots could maneuver aggressively without fear of overstressing airframe or inducing uncontrollable flight conditions. Diving characteristics validated every claim about the Corsair's speed potential. Walsh pushed the nose over into a 30-degree dive, watching the airspeed indicator climb past 350, then 400, finally stabilizing at 420 miles per hour. The aircraft remained rock-solid throughout, its heavy wing loading and robust structure eliminating the buffeting and control flutter that plagued lighter fighters at high speeds. This diving performance would prove crucial in combat, allowing Corsair pilots to engage enemy formations at will and disengage whenever tactical situations became unfavorable. The combat trial began on February 14th, when 12 Corsairs from Marine Fighting Squadron 124, the Flying Buccaneers, escorted a formation of SBD Dauntless dive bombers toward Japanese positions on Kolombangara Island. Intelligence had warned of probable fighter interception, making this an ideal test of the Corsair's combat capabilities against experienced Japanese pilots flying proven Zero fighters. Contact came at 1:45 hours, approximately 40 miles northwest of Guadalcanal. 20 Japanese fighters, a mixed formation of Zeros and the newer Nakajima J-1N interceptors, dove toward the American formation from 25,000 feet. The Japanese tactical approach followed established doctrine, using altitude advantage to build speed for slashing attacks that would scatter the escort fighters before concentrating on the vulnerable bombers. Walsh led his division into a climbing turn that intercepted the Japanese formation before they could reach the bombers. The Corsair's superior climb rate transformed what should have been a disadvantageous position into an equal engagement, allowing American fighters to meet the diving Japanese at co-altitude rather than being forced into defensive responses from below. This single tactical advantage, the ability to climb rapidly enough to counter altitude-based attacks, would prove more valuable than any other Corsair characteristic. The first engagement lasted less than 30 seconds, but revealed everything about how Pacific air combat was about to change. Walsh selected a Zero, pulling out of its initial dive, probably flown by a pilot with substantial combat experience based on the smoothness of his maneuvers. The Japanese pilot immediately entered a hard left turn, the classic Zero defensive response that exploited superior turning radius to force pursuing fighters into unfavorable positions. But Walsh didn't try to match the Zero's turn. Instead, he used the Corsair's speed advantage to execute a vertical displacement maneuver, climbing above the turning Zero while maintaining forward velocity. The Japanese pilot, expecting his pursuer to either follow into the turn or break off the attack, suddenly found himself in a completely defensive position as Walsh dove from above with a 500-mile-per-hour speed advantage. The Corsair's armament delivered devastating effectiveness during the brief firing opportunity. 6 50-caliber machine guns, 3 mounted in each wing, concentrated their fire with mechanical precision. Walsh squeezed the trigger for less than 2 seconds, watching his tracer rounds converge on the Zero's engine cowling from a range of 300 yards. The Japanese fighter absorbed multiple hits before its fuel tank ignited, transforming the aircraft into a falling fireball that scattered debris across 2,000 yards of empty sky. 2 more Zeros fell during the next 3 minutes as Marine pilots adapted their tactics to exploit the Corsair's performance advantages. The Japanese formation, accustomed to American fighters that could be drawn into turning combat, found themselves facing opponents who refused to fight on Japanese terms. High-speed slashing attacks replaced traditional dogfighting, with Corsairs using their superior speed and diving performance to attack, disengage, and reposition before Japanese pilots could respond effectively. The engagement's most revealing moment came when 4 Zeros attempted to trap Lieutenant Robert Hansen in a coordinated attack that should have been fatal. The Japanese pilots executed textbook tactics, setting up crossing firing positions that would force Hansen into defensive maneuvering where the Zero's superior agility would prove decisive. But Hansen simply advanced his throttle to full power and dove away from the attack, accelerating to over 400 miles per hour before any Japanese fighter could follow. The Zeros attempted pursuit, but their maximum diving speed of approximately 350 miles per hour left them falling further behind with each second. Hansen had opened the distance to over 2 miles before the Japanese pilots abandoned their pursuit, recognizing the futility of chasing an aircraft that could simply fly away from any tactical situation. For the first time in the Pacific War, American fighters held the tactical initiative through sheer performance superiority. The mission returned to Guadalcanal, having destroyed 11 Japanese fighters against 2 Corsair losses. Both pilots recovered safely after ditching near friendly positions. More significantly, the engagement had demonstrated that the Corsair's performance advantages could neutralize Japanese tactical expertise and aircraft maneuverability through systematic application of speed and firepower. The rejected carrier fighter was about to become the most feared aircraft in the Pacific theater. Japanese combat reports from the February 14th engagement began appearing in Allied intelligence summaries within days, translated from captured documents and radio intercepts. The language revealed growing concern about American fighter capabilities that exceeded previous performance levels by margins that demanded tactical reassessment. References to the new bent-wing fighter appear frequently, along with observations about unprecedented speed and climbing ability that made traditional interception tactics increasingly ineffective. The most striking intelligence came from a captured Japanese pilot who had survived an encounter with Corsairs near Rabaul. His interrogation, conducted through interpreters at Allied intelligence facilities, provided the first direct testimony about Japanese pilot perceptions of the new American fighter. The prisoner described hearing a distinctive whistling sound moments before the American fighters appeared, a high-pitched shriek that seemed to come from everywhere at once. By the time pilots could visually identify the attacking aircraft, they were already under fire from opponents whose speed made effective response nearly impossible. The whistling sound, created by airflow through the Corsair's engine cooling intakes and over its massive propeller at high speeds, became psychologically devastating for Japanese pilots and ground troops. Unlike radar warning systems or radio alerts that could be jammed or disrupted, the Corsair's acoustic signature provided unavoidable notification that death was approaching at over 400 miles per hour. Japanese soldiers throughout the Pacific learned to associate that sound with devastating strafing attacks that arrived with minimal warning and inflicted catastrophic casualties. By March, Marine Corsair squadrons were operating throughout the Solomons, conducting fighter sweeps and bomber escort missions that steadily eroded Japanese air strength through favorable exchange ratios. VMF 124 reported destroying 47 enemy aircraft during March operations while losing 8 Corsairs, a nearly 6-to-1 kill ratio that would have been considered impossible just months earlier. Other Marine squadrons achieved similar results, transforming the tactical balance in the Solomons from contested airspace to increasingly American-dominated skies. The Corsair's impact extended beyond air-to-air combat into ground attack roles, where its robust construction and heavy armament proved equally devastating. Each aircraft could carry up to 4,000 pounds of bombs or rockets in addition to its 650 caliber machine guns, creating a strike platform capable of destroying targets that previously required dedicated bomber missions. Japanese positions that had withstood weeks of conventional bombing found themselves subjected to precision attacks from fighters that could deliver ordnance with accuracy while defending themselves against enemy interceptors. The tactical revolution centered on systematic exploitation of performance advantages that Japanese pilots simply could not counter with existing equipment or training. Corsair pilots adopted the thach weave, a defensive formation developed earlier in the war, but now enhanced by the Corsair's speed margins. Two fighters flew parallel courses separated by several hundred yards, turning toward each other whenever threatened by enemy fighters. This tactic transformed potential ambushes into deadly traps as Japanese pilots pursuing one Corsair suddenly found themselves facing head-on attacks from its wingman. The results proved devastating for Japanese fighter units attempting to defend against increasingly aggressive American operations. The 582nd Air Group, an elite Imperial Japanese Navy fighter unit equipped with Zero fighters and experienced pilots, engaged Marine Corsairs near Bougainville on April 7th. The air battle lasted 23 minutes and resulted in 17 Japanese fighters destroyed against 3 Corsair losses. Post-battle intelligence revealed that surviving Japanese pilots reported being unable to effectively engage opponents whose speed advantages allowed them to dictate all engagement parameters. More concerning for Japanese commanders, the Corsair's operational characteristics enabled sustained combat operations that Japanese logistics simply could not match. American fighters could conduct multiple missions daily, supported by sophisticated maintenance organizations and abundant spare parts. Japanese units, increasingly isolated by Allied naval dominance and struggling with inadequate supply lines, found their operational tempo declining precisely when American pressure was intensifying. The psychological impact on Japanese fighter pilots became apparent through declining combat effectiveness and rising casualty rates among even experienced aviators. Veterans who had dominated Pacific skies during 1942 found themselves unable to exploit their expertise against opponents who refused traditional air combat engagement. The careful maneuvering and patient positioning that had characterized Japanese tactical doctrine became irrelevant when American fighters could simply accelerate away from unfavorable situations before re-engaging at their convenience. By May 1943, just 3 months after the Corsair's combat debut, Japanese intelligence officers were compiling desperate assessments of American fighter capabilities that revealed the extent of the tactical revolution. The new bent-wing fighter, they reported, possessed speed and climbing ability that exceeded all existing Japanese aircraft by margins that could not be overcome through pilot skill or tactical innovation. Traditional combat methods that had proven effective against earlier American fighters were producing catastrophic casualties when applied against Corsairs. The name emerged gradually through the months of sustained combat, appearing in captured documents and intercepted communications with increasing frequency. Whistling death. The literal translation from Japanese carried ominous implications that transcended simple aircraft identification. This wasn't merely tactical recognition of a capable enemy fighter. It represented psychological acknowledgement that American air power had achieved technological superiority that Japanese industry and training systems could not effectively counter within any reasonable time frame. Ground combat troops throughout Japanese-held territories learned to recognize the distinctive sound that preceded devastating strafing attacks. The Corsair's 650 caliber machine guns could deliver over 100 rounds per second, concentrated firepower that carved through defensive positions, supply dumps, and troop concentrations with surgical precision. Japanese units conducting daylight movements found themselves subjected to constant harassment from fighters that could appear with minimal warning, deliver their attacks, and disappear before defensive measures could respond effectively. The acoustic signature became so psychologically effective that American commanders began incorporating it into tactical planning. Corsair formations approaching Japanese positions would deliberately increase speed during final approach, maximizing the propeller-generated whistle that announced their arrival. The sound created panic among ground troops who understood from bitter experience that they had perhaps 20 seconds before 600 pounds of ordnance arrived with devastating accuracy. Japanese attempts to counter the Corsair threat through improved tactics and aircraft modifications produced minimal results against performance advantages that exceeded Japanese engineering capabilities. The Nakajima Ki 84 Frank, introduced in mid-1944, represented Japan's most capable fighter design with speed approaching 400 miles per hour and improved armament. But even this advanced fighter could only achieve performance parity with the Corsair at best, while suffering from reliability issues and inadequate production numbers that prevented it from significantly affecting the overall tactical balance. The most revealing Japanese assessment came from a captured Imperial Japanese Navy combat report dated June 1943. The document, translated by Allied intelligence officers, described Corsair combat characteristics with clinical precision that could not disguise underlying desperation. American pilots exploit superior speed to engage and disengage at will, the report stated. Traditional defensive maneuvers prove ineffective when enemy fighters can simply accelerate beyond pursuit range. Recommended countermeasures include avoiding combat with bent-wing fighters whenever possible, and focusing defensive efforts on slower American aircraft types. This was psychological surrender disguised as tactical advice. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had opened the Pacific War with confident assertions of fighter superiority, was now instructing its pilots to avoid combat with specific American aircraft because defeating them had become tactically impossible for all but the most exceptional pilots under ideal conditions. The admission carried implications that extended far beyond individual air combat outcomes, suggesting that Japan's industrial and technological limitations were producing military disadvantages that courage and fighting spirit could no longer overcome. By summer 1943, Corsair squadrons were pushing deeper into Japanese-held territory, conducting long-range escort missions and fighter sweeps that demonstrated unprecedented operational reach. The fighter's internal fuel capacity of 237 gallons, plus 300 gallons in external drop tanks, provided combat radius approaching 650 miles. This range enabled strikes against targets that had previously existed beyond Allied fighter protection, forcing Japanese commanders to defend installations they had considered safely distant from American air bases. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Rabaul campaign illustrated the Corsair's strategic impact most dramatically. The massive Japanese fortress, defended by over 200 fighters and extensive anti-aircraft defenses, had withstood months of conventional bombing raids. But sustained Corsair operations throughout late 1943 systematically destroyed Japanese air strength through favorable exchange ratios that Japanese logistics could not sustain. Marine and Navy Corsair squadrons flew hundreds of missions against Rabaul between September and November, achieving kill ratios that averaged 4-1, while maintaining bomber escort effectiveness that allowed devastating attacks on harbour facilities and supply installations. Lieutenant Robert Hansen emerged as the Corsair's most successful practitioner, accumulating 25 confirmed victories during 6 months of intense combat operations. His tactical methods exemplified the systematic exploitation of performance advantages that defined Corsair combat doctrine. Hansen refused traditional dogfighting under any circumstances, instead using speed and altitude advantages to establish ideal attack positions before engaging. His kill record included multiple instances where he destroyed Japanese fighters that never knew they were under attack until his opening burst struck home. The tactical evolution continued through early 1944 as Corsair units refined their techniques through hundreds of combat missions. The high-altitude bounce became standard doctrine, with American fighters maintaining altitude advantages of 5,000 to 10,000 feet above expected enemy positions. This tactical positioning allowed Corsair pilots to dive on Japanese formations with tremendous speed advantages, deliver devastating attacks, and climb back to altitude before enemy pilots could effectively respond. Japanese fighter tactics adapted gradually to these new realities, but adaptation meant survival rather than victory. Veteran pilots learned to maintain constant vigilance for the characteristic whistle that preceded Corsair attacks, attempting to maneuver defensively before American fighters achieved ideal firing positions. But such defensive flying degraded Japanese combat effectiveness, transforming aggressive interceptor missions into desperate survival exercises, where avoiding casualties became the primary objective rather than destroying enemy bombers. The most comprehensive analysis of Corsair combat effectiveness came from Lieutenant Commander John Blackburn, who compiled statistical data from all Pacific Theater Corsair operations between February and December 1943. His classified report, distributed to senior Navy and Marine Corps commanders, painted a picture of tactical dominance that exceeded even optimistic projections from the aircraft's development phase. 11 Corsair squadrons had flown 8,140 combat sorties during the 10-month period, engaging Japanese fighters in 412 separate air-to-air encounters. The result was 584 confirmed Japanese aircraft destroyed against 189 Corsair losses, a kill ratio of 3.1 to 1. More significantly, when the analysis excluded losses to anti-aircraft fire and operational accidents, focusing only on air-to-air combat results, the ratio improved to 4.7 to 1. These numbers represented unprecedented combat effectiveness for American fighters in the Pacific Theater. The bomber escort statistics proved even more impressive. Corsairs had escorted 1,247 bomber missions during the study period, with protected bomber formations losing an average of 1.3 aircraft per mission to enemy fighters. Comparable missions, escorted by other American fighter types, averaged 3.8 bomber losses per mission, a differential that represented hundreds of American airmen who returned safely because Corsair escorts prevented Japanese fighters from reaching their targets. Individual squadron performance revealed how rapidly Marine pilots had mastered the Corsair's unique capabilities. VMF 215, the Fighting Corsairs, achieved a kill ratio of 5.6 to 1 during operations around New Georgia and Bougainville. VMF 214, the famous Black Sheep Squadron led by Major Gregory Boyington, accumulated 126 confirmed victories against 19 losses during their initial combat tour. These results reflected not just aircraft superiority, but systematic application of tactical doctrine that maximized Corsair's strengths while avoiding situations that might favor Japanese maneuverability advantages. The most dramatic demonstration of Corsair capabilities came during the Bougainville campaign, where American forces established forward air bases within fighter range of Rabaul. The strategic situation forced Japanese commanders into a desperate defensive posture, committing their remaining experienced pilots to missions where they faced overwhelming tactical disadvantages. Corsair squadrons based at Torokina airfield flew continuous combat air patrols over the invasion beaches, engaging Japanese raids before they could threaten vulnerable transport ships and supply operations. January 27, 1944 brought the largest air battle of the Bougainville campaign when over 100 Japanese aircraft launched a maximum effort strike against American positions. Intelligence had provided advance warning, allowing Marine commanders to position 32 Corsairs at optimal altitude and position to intercept the incoming raid. The resulting air battle became legendary throughout the Pacific Theater as the ultimate validation of Corsair combat effectiveness. Major Gregory Boyington led the 1st Corsair Division to intercept the Japanese formation at 24,000 feet, approximately 30 miles northwest of Torokina. The Japanese strike force included 60 Zero fighters escorting 40 Betty bombers, a massive concentration of air power, representing Japan's desperate attempt to disrupt American operations through overwhelming numbers. The tactical situation appeared favorable for Japanese forces, but appearances concealed the fundamental performance disparities that would determine the battle's outcome. Boyington's division executed a classic high-altitude bounce, diving from 28,000 feet with tremendous speed advantages that transformed the engagement before Japanese pilots could respond effectively. The Corsairs plunged through the Japanese fighter screen at over 450 miles per hour, each pilot selecting bomber targets with practiced efficiency. The opening attack destroyed 7 Betty bombers in less than 20 seconds, their unarmored fuel tanks igniting under concentrated .50 caliber fire that no aircraft could survive. The Japanese fighter escort attempted to respond according to established doctrine, breaking formation to engage the attacking Corsairs in turning combat, where zero agility should have provided tactical advantages. But the Marine pilots refused to be drawn into turning fights, instead using their superior speed to climb back to altitude after each attack run. The Japanese fighters found themselves chasing opponents who could accelerate away from any threatening situation before repositioning for another high-speed attack. Additional Corsair divisions arrived at staggered intervals, having been vectored to the battle by fighter direction officers monitoring the engagement from Torokina. The battle developed into a systematic destruction of Japanese air power as successive waves of Corsairs engaged at their convenience, while Japanese pilots struggled to maintain formation cohesion under continuous high-speed attacks. The distinctive whistle of diving Corsairs became a constant background noise as American fighters established complete tactical dominance through superior speed and coordinated attacks. The air battle lasted 42 minutes and ranged over 60 square miles of sky, but the outcome was never seriously in doubt once initial contact established American tactical superiority. Boyington's squadron alone destroyed 26 Japanese aircraft during the engagement, while other Corsair units accounted for another 31 confirmed kills. The total Japanese loss exceeded 57 aircraft, including most of the bomber force and nearly half the fighter escort. American losses totaled 8 Corsairs, with 6 pilots recovered safely. The January 27th battle marked a psychological turning point in the Pacific Air War. Japanese commanders recognized that committing their remaining air strength to large-scale operations against Corsair-defended targets would produce unsustainable casualties without achieving meaningful tactical results. Future Japanese air operations increasingly emphasized small-scale harassment raids and defensive patrols rather than the aggressive offensive operations that had characterized earlier campaigns. Post-battle analysis revealed the extent of Japanese tactical desperation through captured radio communications and prisoner interrogations. Japanese pilots reported that the American fighters seemed to be everywhere simultaneously, appearing from above with minimal warning and disappearing before effective countermeasures could be implemented. Multiple pilots described the psychological impact of hearing the Corsair's distinctive whistle moments before attacks materialized, creating stress conditions that degraded combat performance even among experienced aviators. The intelligence documentation included a captured Japanese Navy combat report that provided extraordinary insight into enemy perceptions of Corsair capabilities. The bent-wing fighters possess speed and diving performance that makes interception nearly impossible, the report stated. Their pilots refuse turning combat under all circumstances, instead exploiting altitude and speed advantages to attack repeatedly while minimizing their own vulnerability. Recommended defensive measures include maintaining maximum altitude and attempting to disengage when Corsairs are detected, avoiding combat whenever possible. This represented complete psychological defeat for an air arm that had opened the Pacific War with confident assertions of tactical and technological superiority. The Imperial Japanese Navy was now instructing its pilots to avoid combat with specific American aircraft, because achieving favorable outcomes had become virtually impossible except under rare circumstances that American pilots carefully avoided creating. The Corsair's ground attack capabilities proved equally devastating for Japanese defensive operations throughout the Pacific. Marine and Navy squadrons developed specialized tactics for close air support missions that delivered devastating firepower against fortified positions while minimizing vulnerability to anti-aircraft defenses. The standard approach involved high-speed runs at altitudes between 1,000 and 3,000 feet, releasing bombs or rockets before pulling up sharply to avoid defensive fire. The rocket armament proved particularly effective against Japanese defensive installations. Each Corsair could carry 8 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, weapons that delivered explosive force equivalent to destroyer gunfire with considerably greater accuracy. The rockets' flat trajectory allowed pilots to aim them like oversized machine guns, achieving hit probabilities that made them ideal for destroying bunkers, supply dumps, and artillery positions that conventional bombing struggled to eliminate. Lieutenant Dean Caswell pioneered close air support techniques during operations on Peleliu, where Japanese defenders had constructed elaborate cave systems that withstood conventional naval bombardment. Caswell's tactics involved approaching targets at high speed and low altitude, firing rockets in pairs to bracket defensive positions, before following up with strafing runs that suppressed any surviving defenders. His methods reduced Japanese strongpoints that had resisted weeks of conventional attacks, providing crucial support for marine infantry advancing through brutal terrain against fanatical resistance. The ground attack missions carried significant risks despite the Corsair's robust construction. Japanese anti-aircraft defenses concentrated around critical installations included numerous 25mm automatic weapons that could deliver devastating fire against low-flying aircraft. The Corsair's armor protection and structural strength allowed it to absorb battle damage that would destroy lighter aircraft, but concentrated defensive fire still claimed steady casualties among squadrons conducting close support operations. The most challenging missions involved strikes against heavily defended Japanese airfields, where concentrated anti-aircraft positions created nearly impenetrable defensive zones. These raids required careful coordination and precise timing to minimize exposure to defensive fire while achieving mission objectives. The standard approach involved high-speed approaches at wave-top altitude to avoid radar detection, followed by zoom climbs to attack altitude, and immediate diving attacks that spent minimal time within the anti-aircraft engagement envelope. Rabaul remained the ultimate test of Corsair capabilities against the most formidable Japanese defenses in the Pacific theater. The fortress base featured over 200 anti-aircraft guns, protecting 4 separate airfields and extensive support facilities. Allied intelligence estimated that defensive fire could deliver over 10,000 rounds per minute into the airspace above critical installations, creating a barrage that no aircraft could survive for extended periods. The sustained Rabaul campaign between September 1943 and February 1944 demonstrated how systematic application of superior technology could neutralize defensive advantages through relentless pressure that enemy logistics could not sustain. Corsair squadrons flew daily missions against Rabaul installations, accepting steady but manageable casualties while inflicting damage that accumulated to strategic significance over time. Japanese replacement rates could not match American attrition, forcing gradual withdrawal of air units to defensive positions further from advancing Allied forces. By March 1944, Rabaul had been effectively neutralized through air operations alone, bypassed rather than directly assaulted in a strategic decision that saved thousands of Allied casualties. The fortress base that had once coordinated Japanese air operations across the Southwest Pacific remained garrisoned but isolated, its aircraft destroyed, and its defensive capabilities degraded to tactical irrelevance. This achievement represented unprecedented success for air power, employed strategically to eliminate enemy strongpoints without costly ground assaults. The carrier operations that the Navy had initially rejected Corsairs for performing became increasingly urgent, as American forces pushed westward across the Pacific. The fast carrier task forces conducting strikes against Japanese-held islands needed every available fighter for combat, air patrol, and escort duties. By April 1944, carrier aviation commanders were reconsidering their earlier rejection of the Corsair, particularly as combat reports demonstrated its overwhelming superiority over Japanese fighters under all tactical conditions. The solution emerged through systematic training programs that addressed the handling characteristics that had caused earlier carrier qualification failures. New approach procedures emphasized power-on landings that improved forward visibility during the critical final approach phase. Modified seat positions raised pilots higher in the cockpit, enhancing their ability to see the carrier deck during landing. Most significantly, extensive practice with experienced instructors transformed the challenging carrier landing from a dangerous emergency into a manageable if demanding routine procedure. Navy Squadron VF-17, the Jolly Rogers, became the first carrier-based Corsair unit when they deployed aboard USS Bunker Hill in March 1944. Their combat debut during strikes against Truk Atoll validated Navy confidence in the carrier-qualified Corsair, with the squadron destroying 21 Japanese aircraft during 2 days of intensive operations. More importantly, carrier landing operations proceeded without serious incidents, demonstrating that proper training could overcome the handling characteristics that had initially prevented carrier deployment. The strategic implications of carrier-based Corsair operations extended Allied fighter coverage across vast ocean distances that land-based aircraft could never reach. Fast carrier task forces could now operate deep into Japanese-controlled waters, with fighter protection that matched or exceeded anything Japanese naval aviation could deploy. This capability proved crucial during the Philippine Sea campaign, where American carrier fighters established complete air superiority over Japanese naval forces, attempting to defend their critical inner defensive perimeter. The Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19th and 20th, 1944, represented the ultimate validation of American fighter technology and tactical doctrine. Over 400 carrier-based fighters, including substantial Corsair contingents, engaged Japanese naval aviation in the war's largest carrier battle. The result became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a massacre that destroyed Japanese naval air power as an effective fighting force through kill ratios that exceeded 8-1. Corsair squadrons accounted for a significant portion of the 476 Japanese aircraft destroyed during the 2-day battle. Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu of VF-16 achieved legendary status by destroying 6 enemy aircraft during a single engagement, executing textbook high-speed attacks that gave his targets no opportunity for effective response. His performance exemplified how thoroughly American pilots had mastered tactics that exploited Corsair performance advantages while avoiding situations that might favor Japanese capabilities. The most revealing moment came during post-battle analysis, when American intelligence officers reviewed gun camera footage from hundreds of aerial engagements. The recordings showed Japanese pilots attempting traditional defensive maneuvers that had proven effective against earlier American fighters, only to discover that Corsairs could simply power away from any threatening situation before repositioning for another attack. Multiple sequences showed Japanese fighters entering maximum rate turns, while their Corsair opponents climbed vertically away, building altitude for subsequent diving attacks that arrived before Japanese pilots could recover from their defensive maneuvering. Japanese naval aviation never recovered from the Philippine Sea disaster. The combination of irreplaceable pilot losses and destroyed carrier aircraft eliminated Japan's ability to conduct offensive carrier operations for the remainder of the war. Subsequent Japanese naval aviation efforts focused on desperate defensive measures, including kamikaze attacks that represented psychological acknowledgement that conventional aerial combat against American fighters had become tactically hopeless. The kamikaze threat created new challenges for Corsair pilots, assigned to combat air patrol duties, protecting the carrier task forces. Shooting down conventional attackers required standard intercept procedures and relatively brief engagements. Destroying suicide aircraft demanded absolute success before they could reach their targets, creating psychological pressure that transformed routine intercept missions into desperate races against pilots willing to die if they could inflict damage before being shot down. Corsair pilots adapted to the kamikaze threat through systematic refinement of intercept procedures that maximized their performance advantages. The standard response involved high-speed head-on attacks that provided maximum closure rates and multiple firing opportunities before kamikaze aircraft could reach their targets. The Corsair's concentrated firepower proved ideal for this mission, with 650 caliber machine guns delivering enough destructive force to disintegrate attacking aircraft through sustained fire. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia developed the most effective anti-kamikaze tactics through systematic analysis of engagement, geometry, and firing solutions. His methods emphasized team coordination, with 4-plane divisions working together to establish overlapping intercept zones that ensured multiple firing opportunities against each attacking aircraft. Valencia's division destroyed over 50 kamikaze attackers during operations off Okinawa, demonstrating that proper tactics could neutralize even suicide attacks when applied systematically by well-trained pilots flying superior aircraft. The Okinawa campaign represented the final major test of Corsair capabilities against desperate Japanese defensive efforts. Between April and June 1945, Marine and Navy Corsair squadrons flew over 64,000 sorties, supporting ground operations and defending the invasion fleet against sustained kamikaze attacks. The operational tempo exceeded anything previously attempted in naval aviation history, with individual pilots flying multiple missions daily for weeks without pause. The statistical results validated every claim about Corsair combat effectiveness. Corsair pilots destroyed over 650 kamikaze attackers during the Okinawa campaign, achieving success rates that prevented catastrophic damage to the invasion fleet, despite Japan's most concentrated suicide attacks of the entire war. The defensive success came at significant cost, with 164 Corsairs lost to all causes during the 3-month campaign. But these losses represented acceptable attrition rates, given the operational tempo and mission criticality. Marine Corsair squadrons conducted extensive close air support operations during ground combat on Okinawa, delivering devastating firepower against Japanese defensive positions that slowed American advances through the island's brutal terrain. The close coordination between marine air and ground forces reached unprecedented levels of effectiveness, with forward air controllers directing strikes against targets within hundreds of yards of friendly positions. The precision attacks eliminated Japanese strongpoints that conventional artillery struggled to suppress, saving countless marine casualties during some of the war's most intense ground combat. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Corsair squadrons had established the most distinguished combat record of any American fighter aircraft in the Pacific theater. The final statistical compilation revealed performance that exceeded even optimistic projections from the aircraft's development phase. 2,140 confirmed Japanese aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat represented approximately 11% of total Japanese aircraft losses during the Pacific War. The kill-to-loss ratio of 11.3 to 1 stood as the highest achieved by any American fighter type during World War II, significantly exceeding the performance of other capable designs like the P-51 Mustang or P-38 Lightning. This differential reflected not just aircraft superiority, but systematic tactical application that maximized performance advantages while minimizing vulnerability to enemy capabilities. Corsair pilots had transformed superior technology into overwhelming combat effectiveness through professional expertise and careful mission planning. The bomber escort statistics proved equally impressive in their demonstration of sustained operational effectiveness. Over 7,800 bomber missions escorted by Corsair fighters averaged just 0.87 bombers lost per mission to enemy fighters, the lowest loss rate achieved by any escort fighter type in any theater during the entire war. These numbers represented thousands of American airmen who survived combat missions because their escorts prevented Japanese fighters from reaching attack positions. Ground attack missions accounted for another dimension of Corsair combat effectiveness that statistics struggled to capture fully. The thousands of sorties against Japanese installations, supply lines, and defensive positions throughout the Pacific destroyed infrastructure and equipment that Japan's deteriorating logistics system could not replace. The cumulative impact of sustained interdiction operations starved isolated Japanese garrisons of supplies and reinforcements, transforming defensive positions into death traps, where defenders faced inevitable defeat through attrition rather than direct assault. Individual pilot achievements illustrated the Corsair's capabilities through personal combat records that would have seemed impossible in earlier aircraft. Major Gregory Boyington accumulated 26 confirmed victories before being shot down and captured during combat operations near Rabaul. Captain Kenneth Walsh finished the war with 21 confirmed kills, earned during some of the most intense fighting over the Solomons. Lieutenant Robert Hansen destroyed 25 Japanese aircraft during 6 months of sustained combat before being killed during a low-altitude strafing mission on February 3, 1944. The most successful Corsair pilot was Marine Captain David McCampbell, who destroyed 34 enemy aircraft during carrier operations in 1944 and 45. His tactics exemplified systematic exploitation of Corsair performance advantages, using altitude and speed to establish ideal attack positions before engaging with devastating firepower. McCampbell's achievement of 9 kills during a single mission on October 24, 1944, represented the ultimate expression of fighter pilot skill combined with superior aircraft performance. The acoustic signature that gave the Corsair its Japanese nickname remained psychologically effective throughout the war. Ground combat troops on Pacific Islands learned to recognize the distinctive whistle as harbinger of devastating close air support that could arrive within minutes of being requested. Japanese defenders understood the same sound as warning that they had perhaps 30 seconds before concentrated firepower eliminated whatever position they occupied. The psychological impact proved as significant as the physical destruction, creating stress conditions that degraded defensive effectiveness even when Corsair attacks failed to inflict immediate casualties. Post-war analysis by Japanese military historians revealed the extent of the Corsair's psychological impact on Japanese forces throughout the Pacific. The bent-wing fighter came to symbolize American technological and industrial superiority that Japan's courage and fighting spirit could not overcome through conventional military means. The systematic destruction of Japanese air power through favorable exchange ratios that Japanese replacement rates could never match demonstrated the futility of continuing resistance against opponents who held overwhelming material advantages in every significant category. The most comprehensive Japanese assessment came from Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, whose wartime diary provided extraordinary insights into Japanese perceptions of declining military fortunes. His entries from mid-1944 onward referenced the bent-wing fighters repeatedly, acknowledging their role in establishing American air superiority that made Japanese defensive operations increasingly hopeless. Ugaki recognized that Japan faced opponents who combined superior technology with professional competence that made victory impossible, regardless of Japanese determination or tactical innovations. The Corsair's combat record extended beyond World War II into the Korean War, where Marine and Navy squadrons flew the improved F4U-4 and F4U-5 variants in ground attack and interdiction roles. The aircraft's robust construction and heavy payload capacity made it ideal for close air support missions supporting United Nations ground forces against North Korean and Chinese armies. Corsair squadrons flew over 80,000 sorties during the Korean conflict, demonstrating remarkable longevity for a design that had entered service nearly a decade earlier. The final combat mission, flown by a Corsair, occurred on December 22, 1952, when a Marine pilot conducted a close air support sortie near the 38th parallel. By then, jet fighters had replaced propeller-driven aircraft in most frontline roles, but the Corsair's combination of payload, capacity, accuracy, and endurance kept it relevant for specialized missions that newer aircraft performed less effectively. The retirement of the last operational Corsair squadrons in 1953 marked the end of an era in naval aviation history. The legacy extended far beyond combat statistics into fundamental transformations in American naval aviation doctrine and capabilities. The Corsair proved that purpose-designed carrier fighters could achieve performance levels matching or exceeding land-based designs while maintaining the operational flexibility that made carrier aviation strategically decisive. This understanding shaped subsequent American fighter development, leading directly to jet-powered carrier aircraft that dominated naval aviation throughout the Cold War era. The technical innovations incorporated in the Corsair's design influenced aircraft development for decades. The inverted gull wing configuration, initially adopted to accommodate the massive propeller while maintaining reasonable landing gear length, provided aerodynamic benefits that later designers adapted for various applications. The emphasis on pilot visibility through bubble canopy design became standard for subsequent fighter generations. Most significantly, the systematic integration of powerful engines with airframe designs optimized for specific combat roles established methodologies that guided fighter development through the jet age. The human dimension of the Corsair story remained its most significant legacy. The thousands of pilots and crew chiefs who operated and maintained these aircraft under combat conditions demonstrated professional excellence that transformed superior technology into overwhelming tactical advantage. Their systematic exploitation of performance capabilities, while avoiding situations that might favor enemy strengths, established tactical doctrines that remained relevant across subsequent generations of air combat evolution. The distinctive whistle that gave the Corsair its fearsome nickname faded into history, along with the propeller-driven fighters that dominated World War II skies. But the lessons learned through systematic application of technological advantages against capable opponents remained relevant throughout subsequent conflicts. The Corsair demonstrated that victory in modern warfare demanded not just capable equipment, but professional forces trained to exploit their advantages while minimizing vulnerabilities through careful tactical planning and disciplined execution. The Japanese pilots who named it Whistling Death understood something profound about their strategic situation that went beyond simple aircraft performance comparison. They recognized that American industrial capacity could produce fighters like the Corsair, in numbers that Japanese manufacturing could never match, while maintaining quality standards that Japanese resource constraints made impossible to sustain. The bent-wing fighter became a symbol of American material superiority that no amount of Japanese courage or tactical innovation could overcome through conventional military means. The 2,140 Japanese aircraft destroyed by Corsair pilots represented individual tragedies for families throughout Japan, who received notification that their sons or husbands would not be returning from combat missions against opponents they could not effectively engage. Each loss diminished Japan's already inadequate pilot replacement capacity, accelerating the spiral of declining combat effectiveness that made eventual defeat inevitable, regardless of continued resistance. The final irony resided in the Navy's initial rejection of the Corsair for carrier operations, a decision based on legitimate handling concerns that careful training eventually overcame. The aircraft that seemed too dangerous for precision carrier landings became the most effective carrier fighter of the Pacific War, achieving combat results that validated every technical challenge overcome during its troubled development. The bent wings that looked wrong transformed into the most recognizable silhouette in Pacific skies, a distinctive profile that Japanese pilots learned to fear and American forces learned to rely upon for air superiority that made ultimate victory possible. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.